used to be easier to cross post between Twitter and Instagram. Like I feel like there were fewer steps or something. Because I've been not great about doing that too. Okay, I did share that we're live on Twitter, so we can hang out for a few minutes. I know Kelly did read this story.
Let's post the link.
YouTube is letting me know that I am now live on my own channel. Thanks, YouTube. Okay. This is completely off topic, but did you see that Jordan Fuego has a
Yes.
new book coming out? I'm so excited. I'm so excited. I didn't realize until I think I was talking about her in a video, and I was like, "Oh, I want to read more things by her." And I think it was maybe Kier who commented like, "Oh, did you see she has a new book coming out?" And I was like, "What?" So that just became one of my most anticipated books for the year.
Yeah, it's set in the same world, right?
Yeah. And like, I mean, I was going to be excited no matter what, but like, I looked at this description and I'm like, sounds good. I'm so looking forward to that. Okay, I was thinking, and I know I should have messaged you about this, but do we want to talk about maybe uh, a book we think deserves more hype as we sort of like transition into the discussion? Because I think that's always a fun question. If you want to open Goodreads, feel free, and
Yeah.
I can also start. I'll start with mine because I absolutely sprung this on you. I even thought about messaging you, and I was like, "Oh, it's too late at night." Why? Because you could have just seen it the next day. Anyway, so one of the ones that I don't think I've heard anybody else read and review it. Obviously, people have read it, um, and it might have even ended up on a couple book lists, but I don't feel like it's made much of a splash on BookTube, which I think it should. And that's What Happened to Rachel Riley by Claire Swinarski, I think is her name. And it's a middle grade contemporary that is sort of a mystery, but what it primarily is about consent and like talking about that for a middle grade audience, um, and how like seemingly innocuous these things are that like happen when kids are young or kids are in middle school, and how it's like it's sort of like parts of the same problem. um yeah, it's really well done. I think the writing is very good. I think the characters are great, but I also just think that the mystery element and how it connects to the themes is fantastic. And it's also like it's completely appropriate for the age audience while also dealing with those topics in a way that I think is very very thoughtful still. Like it doesn't like sugarcoat stuff, and it's a really good one. So I would recommend that for people.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of that one at all.
It's a good one. It's a good one. I think one of the blurbs says like I think it says something about like Me Too for a middle grade audience, which I think maybe might give people a different expectation about how explicit it is, because it's not that intense. But I think one of its strengths is that it doesn't seem that intense, and then you're reading it and you're like, wow, wait, this is actually the exact same problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's just showing up in different ways. So yeah, very very good.
Okay. Yeah, I have just opened Goodreads because I can't remember what I've read in the last week, let alone anything
Water
else.
books, yeah.
But yeah, so one that I read a little while ago was The House of Yesterday by Diba Zaitapur, which
Yeah.
is a YA magical realism ish, about this girl who's Afghan Uzbek, whose parents are looking like they're getting divorced, and whose grandmother is in kind of the late stages of dementia, and she's really struggling with everything. And then she starts seeing a ghost who she thinks is the past of her grandmother. And it's just about kind of grief and memories and how that shows up in a family, and not, I wouldn't say it's about intergenerational trauma in the way we
Hmm.
generally think of it, but it is about how the events that happen in a family trickle down, um,
Yeah.
and how that affects everyone. And also, it's not a cultural background that I was familiar with at all. So that's really nice to see. So, yeah.
I own that one, and it's one I've been really looking forward to. So I'm glad to hear that that you really enjoyed it. That it was
Yeah, I
so
did. I thought it was really good.
yeah. All right. So Anne, perfect segue for the themes of that book. We're going to be talking about Island of Whispers by Frances Harding, illustrated by Emily Gravitt. This is our sort of triumphant return, mini return for the Frances Harding book club. I kind of like the idea that every time she comes up with a new book, we're just going to pop up and talk about it. But this is also part of my Not a Genre book club, which is all about reading and discussing middle grade and young adult books with the same kind of depth and attention to detail that we often give to classics, or to other books, like adult books. I have already linked Hana in the description. Please go and follow her. She's wonderful. You've seen her a lot here on my channel, so we're just kind of skipping the whole intro this time around. And I will also go back and add the links to both of the books that we recommended. Okay, this is a great way to start this
Yeah, it
discussion.
made me cry on the train too.
Uh, this book is so short, but made me cry on the bus. LOL. Yeah, like, and I remember Hannah because you read it first, and when we were talking about it, you were like, "It made me cry, and it's gonna make you cry," and you were right. um, yeah. So, should we just start with like overall thoughts on the story, and also since we are both sort of, Frances Harding experts at this point, how we feel it sort of fits into her work as a whole. Like if we think it is representative or maybe a little different, I would just be curious to hear.
Yeah, well, obviously I loved it. Um, I, yeah, I think it is, I said this in my review, but I think it's kind of a distillation of everything she does well. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's very representative of the kinds of characters and themes and worlds that she writes, but it's, because it's so short, it doesn't have the pacing issues that she sometimes have. So it's a really like accessible way into her writing and the kind of things she's interested in. Um, so I think it would be one I would be likely to recommend to someone who was starting out with her work as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I had the same thought. Co-sign everything you said, because I also loved it, and I also was thinking that this is a really good example of what she does well. While, as you said, it's shorter and more accessible. And one of the things I also was thinking was like, it's a little bit less weird,
Mm.
even though the concept is still incredibly creative and interesting. I feel like maybe because it's so short, it doesn't have the like kind of bizarreness that I think
Hmm.
can make her a little bit harder to recommend. Not that bizarre is bad. We love we love how bizarre her books are. But it's also kind of nice to have one or two that we can be like, this one is less odd, but still like very effective. Um, let's see. Oh, that's so cool. I actually met Frances Harding when she came to my school to advertise Island of Whispers, got my copy of The Lie Tree signed. She drew a little Saracen doodle on it too. Oh, that is so cool. I love that. I'm always impressed like an author's where it's like, I'm not just gonna sign your book. I'm gonna like draw something. Like, amazing. Um, okay, yes. So as we were discussing before we went live, I think because this is such a short book, we're not going to have as many like specific topics to discuss. And also, before we go further, I do want to mention for content warnings, this book deals with grief a lot, and specifically with loss of a child. So just be aware of that before like watching the live show. But yeah, so since we started off talking about we all cried at this book, um, I would be curious if you feel comfortable talking about this. What were those moments? What were some of those? And were they the ones that you would have expected to make you like really emotional or to make you cry?
Um, I don't actually remember what originally made me cry the first time I read it. When I read it again yesterday, basically from when they arrive at the island at the end to the like to the end, um, I cried at all of it.
Yeah. The whole thing. It's short. You could pretty much cry through the whole thing. Yeah.
Um, yeah, which I think is typical for me. Is something I've noticed is that grief is the thing that makes me cry most in media generally.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I wouldn't say it was unexpected, but I thought it was very effective.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I one of the reasons I asked that question is because I was a little surprised at the parts that actually did make me cry, because I was very emotionally invested the entire time. But I think the moments that actually turned into tears did surprise me a little bit. Um, although I don't know why, because I also tend to be very like emotionally connected to stories that deal with grief. Like those tend to make me cry in general. But I think one of the ones that got me was when she watches her father turn into a little boy. And like I don't yeah. It's just it's really, as you said, it's like pretty much from the point they're on the island, there's just a lot of really like poignant moments, but also some of the other ones which we are going to have a short quote section at the end, but it's like the island, but also just some of the turns of phrase that she would use
Hmm.
about what it is like to lose people and trying to hold on to them in spite of that. Like it just it's a good one. Um Ending line is what got me the most. It's a good one. I have the book right here. Let me get the quote. And the cats, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, the bit where when his father tells him that he's proud of him and that he can do things his own way, and
Yeah.
that's also valid.
I know. And like I kind of it's not like it came out of nowhere because of course we're reading this and I just had to check the main character because it's been a little while. Like we're reading this and we're like Milo is perfect. Like leave him alone. But then to see his like father like accept and respect that he does things differently and that that's okay. It's so good. Um yeah. And also I think there were definitely some moments with the young girl that he is escorting that were just very emotional, but not in a way that feels manipulative. Like, I think that's one of the things we've talked about throughout her books that we've discussed is that they're very emotionally evocative, but without being like forced.
Yeah, it feels
Um,
earned.
it feels earned, exactly. Yeah, and with this being such a short story, I think that's really impressive. That it's like I really feel like I went on like a whole
Hmm.
journey for like a full length story. Um, so sort of connected, but I wanted to talk about the sort of the creepiness aspect, which is another thing that she does in most of her books, if not all of them. What do we think about having that fearfulness tied to grief in this way? Um, like the danger of these people, it's like they're trying, Milo and his family, they're trying to help them find peace, but also you have to be careful around them. So I don't know if you had specific thoughts about that and sort of like the way that's handled in the book.
I don't know, because it didn't feel creepy. Like the danger in the book doesn't really come from the ghosts.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, even though like clearly that they are kind of scary and you have to be careful around them, they don't feel dangerous as such. I don't know. I didn't feel like they were the scary bit, or that's not really what Milo's scared of either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're not malicious.
Mm.
Yeah, I was worried the whole time that something was gonna happen because he keeps like looking at them and making eye contact and talking, like doing all the things that you're not supposed to. So I was really worried that something bad would come of that. But I do agree that like it doesn't, even though there is a very explicit danger from the ghosts, that's not really what the main villain of the story
Mm.
is, um, which is interesting. Hello, Kelly. Yes, read this in January. Um, so who is the antagonist or the villain of the story? How did we feel about that? I should mention there are going to be spoilers throughout this because it's very
It's too
short.
short
But
not to. Yeah.
yeah.
Um. I. Yeah. I mean, I guess the Lord is the villain if you want to look at it that way. But again, I think in Francis Harding fashion, he's also humanized at the end as well. Like the
Mm-hmm.
bit about how he missed his daughter, um,
Yeah.
and that's why he was so resistant to letting her go. I thought was really real. Like not having had enough time with the people you love.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. And the way that when he's arguing with Milo about it, it's like it isn't that he doesn't understand the rules. It's that when he's being faced with such a personal loss, he's like, well, surely this is an exception. Because we
mm,
all feel like we're the exception to that. Um, yeah, I thought he was a very effective antagonist in typical Francis Harding fashion, because he is a real threat. Like he's willing to do anything, and his two wizards are arguably like even more antagonistic, I guess, than he
yeah,
is.
like they don't feel like the main like dangerous, but they are definitely the people that feel most scary and the most outwardly malicious.
Yes, yeah, they're like facilitating all the bad things. Um, yeah, and I think that the Lord as well, like he's one of those antagonists where even though what he's doing is obviously wrong and selfish in the way that it can get a lot of other people hurt, you understand him. Like he
Mm.
makes sense as a character, even as like the whole time I'm reading, I'm like, what are you doing? Like this is it's not going to work. Um yeah, I thought he was a really interesting one. Grief is the antagonist. Yeah, this is kind of like a concept is the villain in this book. Or can be depending on how you deal with it. Yeah, so that was one of the things that I thought was really interesting about the way that the villain elements of the story were set up is I feel like one of the things that the story is showing is that grief is normal and struggling with that is not in itself a bad thing, but if you let it, grief and not letting go of things can lead you to do really terrible things. um like I feel like this story sort of shows that like even like certain kinds of like love, like he loves his daughter so much that it's leading him to do these really awful things, and I think that's a really interesting way, because it's not saying that, oh, he should have gotten over it sooner. It's
Mm,
saying that if you turn your pain outward, then you are the villain. You are the
mm,
the one who's creating this hurt for other people. Um, yes, the guilt was a big part as well. His guilt over not using the time he had with his daughter. Yeah, and I definitely wonder if that is the reason he's so determined. It's not just that he can't accept it, but he doesn't want to accept that, not that her dying is his fault, but him not getting to spend time with her was a choice he made,
mm.
and he was always thinking that he would have time to fix it, and he doesn't.
Yeah, and but at the same time, he's also not really thinking clearly enough to see what will happen if he does manage to bring her back, because
Mhm.
the discussion about what will she be, she'll be a doll, she won't be someone with a conscience, and it doesn't seem like because he's so stuck in his grief and his guilt, he hasn't thought about, is he going to spend time with the doll?
Yeah,
It's
yeah. He's like so fixated on the idea of like being able to bring her back that it doesn't matter what she wants or what he does after. It's like he's very like tunnel vision
mm,
is an understatement. Like that's the only thing that he is thinking about or caring about, is like fixing this. And Milo, even though he's so much younger, he's much wiser about things like this, because he's like, you can't just undo this, like, and it's hard and it hurts, but nobody, even a lord, um, can just decide it didn't happen. Um, yeah. Also, it's interesting too because obviously he cares about his daughter, but they weren't very close. And it's kind of interesting thinking about that for the story, where it's like, grief happens even in relationships that aren't perfect,
mm-hmm,
or that are messy, or that have a lot of missed opportunities. That can be its own sort of grief, is like not mourning a close relationship, but like mourning what could have been a closer relationship, and knowing that you made choices that you can't undo.
mm.
um yeah, heavy stuff for this like short little illustrated uh fairy tale here. um yeah, just dropped a stack of books, please ignore the noise. um okay, so I think one of the very prominent moments in the book, or like symbols, is the door
Mm-hmm.
that they go through. I'm sure like English teachers would have a field day with this, writing papers on the symbolism of the door and mortality and everything. I don't know if we had like specific things we wanted to say with that. Um, I think it's very. It seems to me to be very much be like a metaphor for like crossing over, and like not being able to follow people there. Um, the fear of the unknown is like a really big factor in this book. Um, Sorry, that is not a question. This is just like a string of thoughts. Would you like to respond to that?
Um, yeah, well, I agree. It's definitely a kind of prominent motif, and I think it's interesting how differently everyone reacts to it as well,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
um, because the reactions of the Lord and all of his sailors and everyone is very understandable, and I think how most people probably would respond to something like that. But Milo is so, I don't know, like the fact that he gets encouragement from it rather than hopelessness.
Yeah.
Um, it, yeah, it says a lot about who he is, and but also state that he's in that moment, in the fact that just thinking that his death will come at a later time is enough for him to be hopeful.
Yeah, he's like, there are possible futures where I make it through this, and that's that's better than I thought. Um, yeah, and we didn't really talk about Milo specifically, so if we want to do that, like typical, like I love him, perfect angel, never done anything wrong in his whole life. No, yeah, and one thing that really struck me about him is like he spends almost the whole book being like thinking that he's not brave and that he's not smart or he's not good at this, and like obviously we're reading it and we're like, yes you are. But so seeing him get that validation from his dad but also from himself, and especially what that says about like the way he interacts with the ghosts differently, like to me one of the things it says is like empathy is not a weakness, like it's not, it doesn't make you soft, you know, it can actually make you brave, um, which I think is very cool, and especially for a book possibly intended for children. I think that's a really important message that like caring about other people is in fact a brave thing to do. Um, and also we could talk about how it's brave also in connection to it opens yourself up to hurt when you lose people, and that also takes a lot of bravery. But yeah, so other thoughts on Milo?
Yeah, I have no adjectives left to describe Francis Hardy's main characters.
I love this boy so much. Um, yeah, he's doing his best. He's a good person who is doing his best in outlandish circumstances, and I want every good thing for him. um, yeah, and I think it's very telling as well that like he loses his father so unexpectedly, and so he's obviously dealing with grief and loss throughout the story as well, even as he's trying to help other people through that. But I think it is an important character facet for him where like he doesn't really consider doing what the Lord is doing. Like I think maybe at one point he thinks about like, oh, I guess this is why people are tempted to do that, you know, because it just seems like it couldn't have happened this quickly. There must be a mistake. Um, but he, even as young as he is, he understands that he's not the exception, you know? Um, not in a bad way. Like he accepts so much more about the good things and the bad things of caring for people that like the Lord doesn't understand. Um, or he won't let himself understand.
Yeah, well, in a way as well, because he will have seen people coming with the shoes. He will have seen the
Mm-hmm.
entire island coming, so he will have seen that the different ways in which people could deal with it. But equally, you could say the Lord probably, I'm sure, has seen plenty of people dealing with grief as well.
Yeah. But I do think you're right that Milo's specific place definitely like influenced that. Also, you talking about the shoes just reminded me one of the other parts that made me cry. I was not expecting is like the five people who like had the shoes that were like on the journey, and that sort of little mini epilogue you get about them. I'm like crying because like the one, it just it really encapsulates one of the things I love about Frances Hardinge's books, which is that everybody is treated as being important. So that was another part that made me cry when they're talking about like one of them who didn't even have real shoes, and so like what he did instead, and also how even people who don't have a close family to like miss them, they still have an effect on the world, you know? I'm like getting emotional just talking.
And they still have stories to tell and like
Yeah,
value
it's
and
so beautiful. Yeah. Okay. And so this story is obviously illustrated, which her books usually aren't. Emily Gravitt is the one who did the illustrations. So I don't know if we wanted to talk about what that added to the story, what we think it accomplished, anything about the illustrations, because um, I mean, I really liked them. I thought they perfectly fit the tone and the atmosphere of the story.
yeah, yeah. I wasn't familiar with Emily Gravitt at all before this, but I thought they were really effective. I really liked the color scheme.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, and it's sort of like a deceptively simple style, like
mm,
not in a bad way, but it's like she's very economical with the like lines that she uses and everything, but the way that she conveys the emotion of the characters, I think, is really impressive. Yeah. I just like saw this since we're in spoiler territory. I just like saw that page and got emo about it again. Um, yeah.
yeah, I love the one at the end where he's like writing by the tree.
He's what?
Let me see if I can find
Yeah.
it. This one, right at the end.
Yeah. Yeah. Kelly also said, I love the color palette too. The blue added to the melancholy feel of the book. Yeah, I think it really did fit the focus on grief. Um, but I also think that one of the things that comes through, especially with how she drew like the figures, like the people, is like this other thing that we're talking about where it's like there's this underlying beauty to the story, which is like everybody's important. Um, and I have a hard time articulating it, but I feel like the illustration style also reflected that. So, do we have anything before we go to quotes to share? Because even though this is short, I have a few.
You could just read out the whole book.
I know, really, like, we
It's
could
short
just do
enough.
a story time hour. Like,
Um, I I'm not sure if I have anything specific.
okay, I only have a few. Oh, I can't believe I forgot about the birds whose heads were cut off.
It was terrifying. The illustration of the bird is the scariest bit in the whole.
I know. I was like, I don't like this. But even that is something where it's like you do feel sympathy for them because they did not choose this. They were forced into it by these creepy wizard men. um,
Oh
yeah, I
yeah,
went to
and
read a quote and I just saw that image and I'm like, wow.
yeah, when and the wizard men as well. We haven't really talked about, but they were really they're really emblematic of how some people can profit from grief.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like both of the things they think when they see the island, I mean, like this is
Yeah,
how I'm going to make myself powerful and
yeah, yeah. Um, Callie said the description she wrote scared me even more than the picture of the bird. It, yeah, it's like one of those classic, like Frances Hardinge. She'll just throw in something where it's like, well, I didn't know I had to be scared of this. Thanks. um, yeah. So, do we want to do quotes or do we want to? Because, like, you're right, we didn't really talk about the wizard specifically. I also think that we talked about this a little bit, but one of the things that I think the book is also about, besides just grief in general, one thing I like is that she's not making the point that you have to move on from it, or that everybody has to grieve in the same way, or it has to be a certain amount of time. I feel like the point is that you can't use it to hurt other people, and nobody's saying that like these characters are taking too long about it. They're just saying like you can't use what happened to you as an excuse to do whatever you want to try to make yourself feel better. Um, because I feel like that sometimes, not like frequently, but like sometimes in books that deal with grief, I feel like there's sometimes this underlying idea of like everybody reaches a point where you have to move on, and it's like that's not necessarily true. And I think one of the beautiful things about this book is that it recognizes that there is a point where most people can sort of start to function again, but that doesn't mean that you forget or that it doesn't hurt, you know? So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I kind of want to know what happens after this as well, because Milo is now signing himself up to do a lot more emotional labor for everyone on the island. And I kind of
yes.
wonder, in a way, like his father was almost protecting himself by not having to open himself up to that, whereas Milo is now going to be holding
Yeah.
everybody's emotions.
Yeah.
Um,
That's a good point. It's like he needs like an intern or something to like spread the emotional labor around a little more. Um, yeah, that is a really good point. And I also think like so what you were saying about like the wizards and how it sort of speaks to like the way that people can profit off of grief. It's interesting to sort of think about this book in connection with different burial or like funeral practices and like how like especially in the US it's like how clinical the sort of typical like I haven't read the mortician books that everybody has read. I just saw it described in another book and I'm like I don't like this. um so I don't know, that was another thing that I was sort of thinking about while reading this is that the book is like unapologetic about how personal it is. You know, like it's so intimate, like the way that Milo and his family, it's like they personally like escort people like to whatever's next. And that's a big contrast to like the way that capitalism has affected the funeral industry. And obviously like there are different death and burial practices, but in terms of like the sort of big, I don't know what you would call it, but like the very common way of doing it in the US, um, it's like it's trying to separate you from that emotion and that like how raw it is. And the book is like, you can't. Like it's going to be personal no matter what. So you might as well allow yourself to feel it and maybe have some catharsis from that.
yeah.
Okay. I do have just a few quotes, and then if we want to like wrap up with any other thoughts, we can do that as well. Um, this is from one of the wizards. The man in indigo was a craftsman of sorts, with a mind like a very old toolbox. It held sharp things, crookedly clever things, and things that should have been thrown away a long time before. It would not do to reach too hastily into such a mind. You might cut yourself, or put your hand on a spider.
Yeah, that was one that struck me as well.
Yeah. Let's see.
Yeah, I didn't really like. note any specifically um, as I was going. But
This was an unexpected, funny one that I found. Along its sloping top perched dozens of gulls, swooping and quarreling as if they were on a quayside. Milo fancied they were ordinary gulls, if ordinary is the right word for birds that go everywhere, see everything, and usually try to eat it. That's true. I mean, there's a lot of seagulls near where I live, and it's like that is exactly what they're everywhere, and they're trying to eat it like all the time. Okay, the last one I have is like one of my favorites, but I'm like I'm gonna get really emotional about it again, but here we go. This is when his dad is talking to him, and it's the part we're talking about where he's like proud of him.
mhm.
Kindness is not weakness. To be kind in this unkind world is walking through a battlefield without armor or sword. It takes courage and strength to be kind. Yes, exactly. We're on the same wavelength. Like, I feel like that is, in a nutshell, that is like one of the things this book is about. Love it so much. I just knocked more books over. We're going to ignore that. Um, yeah, anybody in the comments, if you had specific lines or specific parts you want to talk about, um, or Hana, any other like things that you wanted to put in the discussion, like that I didn't talk about.
Yeah, I don't know. One other thing I'm kind of wondering about is who is this book for? In the sense
The
that, like,
classic
as
Frances Hardinge
Frances Harding
question.
books go, I feel like this is even harder to market than most of those.
Yeah, I like picturing her agent just being like Frances again. Like, what do I do with this? And she's like, I don't know. I wrote it. Have fun finding somewhere to put it. Um, yeah, I agree. I think it is very because like it is appropriate for kids, but I think a lot of the I don't want to say a lot of the impact, but a lot of the things that we've been talking about, I think are going to affect you more the older you are and the more that you've experienced and the more like loss that you've experienced. So it is interesting like trying to think of who the target audience for this is. It almost feels like it's more about it almost feels like it's written more for like parents that are doing this
Mm,
badly, because of the whole thing with the Lord and like Milo is the main character and his sort of friendship, not friendship with the girl, um, that is one of the main parts of the story, but it almost feels like it's pointed at people who are maybe more like the Lord or who have that potential. I don't know. Do you have thoughts on who this book is for?
I don't know. Yeah, I guess in a way it's for anyone.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I agree. I think there's themes in there that even though a child could read it, they won't necessarily pick up on.
Yeah.
Um, and also an example of how picture books are not always for children.
Yes. Exactly. Well said. Um yeah. And obviously like I don't mean to say that kids can't experience these like deeper themes cuz especially depending on what kind of loss like children have already gone through. It is very possible that they could read this and immediately, connect with like all these things that we're talking about. It's just interesting because I do feel that it is one of those stories where you're going to get more out of it if you like. I feel like if I reread this like years later, I would have like even more sort of like impressions, and I would like recognize even more things that resonate. Um, Definitely a hard one to age, but all the adults love it. So, yeah. I'm glad it's been doing really well. Um, was it nominated for some awards, or did I make that up?
I have no idea. I haven't
Should
had
be,
time
but
to follow any.
yeah, I know. I don't follow either. It's like once in a while something will just like pop up, or like I'll be reading a book. I'm like, oh, there's a new edition with a sticker on it. I guess it won something. Okay. Any any other thoughts? Um,
Nothing from me, I don't think.
yeah, and I definitely agree with something you said at the beginning too, which is like I think this could be a very recommendable book of hers, which is funny given how hard how hard we're trying to like figure out who it's for. Maybe that's who it's for. It's for the people who it's like maybe I'd
Like
like
Frances
Francis
Hardinge
Harding.
Gateway.
Yes, exactly. That's the real reason this book was written. Um, yeah. Anybody in the comments? Any last things to share? Uh, yeah. In conclusion, I love it. Uh, Frances Harding will be hearing from me about the emotional distress. No, but the weird thing is that it wasn't distressing. It was like cathartic, you
Mm-hmm.
know. Um, yeah. Okay. Well, I think that is everything we have for this little reunion episode. Expect us to pop up again when Frances Harding publishes something else, um, where we will still not know who the book is for, which I love. Um, yeah, Hana, anything that you want to like plug that's coming up? Um, yeah, just anything that you want to like share about.
I Yeah, I've been fairly inactive lately, but just want to, I guess, remind everyone that there's still active genocide going on in Palestine, so
Yep.
please keep writing to your political representatives and doing whatever you can about that. Um,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah.
And in actually in our previous uh discussion, we talked about like Hannah shared a couple of um really good like accessible like sources for news and information. So and those are in the description box. So if you want to just go back to the previous episode of the Not a Genre Book Club discussion, or I'm gonna also try to remember to put those in um this description as well. And Hana is also linked there, so be sure to follow her. And I think that's everything. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us, chatting with us, discussing this beautiful little book. And thank you to those of you who watch this later.
Yeah, and thank you for
And
those who are here at such short notice.
yes, oh my gosh, that's just kind of what we do now. It's like surprise, it's happening in 2 days. Um, yes, it was very short notice, so an extra special thank you if you're here.
Yeah.
Um,
Cara, did you want to talk about what you'll be reading next? With
yes, great. You're a better host than I am on like my book club. Yes. So our next sort of series or our next segment of the book club is going to be myself and Julia from Shakespeare and Such reading and discussing the whole Giver Quartet by Lois Lowry. I have read the first book, ready for our discussion, and it's going to be a doozy. I'm really excited. Speaking of how emotional this book got me, I think it's going to be a really great series to focus on, and it's one that I had never read. I feel like it's fairly popular here in the U.S. A lot of kids have, like, a lot of readers like grew up like reading it, and I never did. So, and I think it's probably going to have a lot of similar themes in a way to some of the Frances Harding books we've talked about. So, yes, the announcement for the first live show should be pretty soon. Julia and I are working out the scheduling, but it's going to be a good time. So excited to cry on camera again. I see that
Yeah,
like
I'm looking forward to
I,
joining you for that one because, yeah, like I think I said this when you announced it, this is not a book that it's one I only started hearing about from the book community. It's just not one that is a thing in the UK. So,
yeah, yeah. Isn't it's interesting how there's still that like those like differences of like what is like widely just known about. So, all right, thank you everybody, and
thank you.
we will see you next time for more emotional discussions about books. Bye.